Hello, insiders, and welcome to this new episode of the EU Bubble Insider. Today, our guest is Shada Islam, Managing Director at the New Horizons Project. Shada, welcome to the show. It's a pleasure to have you with us today.
It's wonderful to be with you, Christoph. Thank you very much for inviting me.
The pleasure is all mine, and maybe we could start by telling our listeners, those who don't know you, a little bit about the New Horizons project and what you currently do, and then we get into the interview.
Sure. So I set up the New Horizons project in 2020 after I left the world of think tanks and journalism, and I decided it was time to set out on my own. I call it a media strategy advisory company. It's really my company. It's a one-woman show in many ways. And I focus a lot on the things I've always loved doing, which is writing, speaking, moderating, and of course, I teach as well. So it's multifaceted, as we say in today's language.
And in your career as a journalist and event moderator, you've sat across many global minds. And if you don't mind, I would like to start our conversation today with a request for maybe advice that you could give someone like me about our conversation today. So, what is the one thing you wish that every interviewer, every event moderator would know?
So it's one element, one thing that I think you've already shown, Christoph, by reaching out to me, which is curiosity. I think it's very important that we go into all of these different ideas that we have with a curious, open mind. Of course, we can do our research and learn as much as we can about the person we're interviewing, we're going to be talking to. But I think curiosity, an interest in that person, a readiness to explore new ideas, new visions, new horizons, I think that is the key. Curiosity, open mind, and questioning, exploring together.
You said in our previous conversation that the mode you are working in is back to the future. I very much like that. Could you explain a bit more about that and maybe shed some light about the projects you are currently working on?
Yeah, it's back to the future, really, because when I started off about 4 decades ago writing about the European Union, I was working on what you used to call the developing world, the third world. And it was very interesting, really, because, here in Europe, in Brussels, inside the bubble, if you like, all the journalists were working on what was happening within the EU. And those were really exciting times. I mean, there was a euro currency, enlargement, the single market. And I was all the time contacted by newspapers, radio stations in the Middle East, in Asia, Africa, in Latin America, even saying all of these things, these developments inside the EU, how are they going to impact on us? On the outside world. And so I started connecting the dots, and it became a little bit of my specialization. We call those developing countries the global south today. So, over the years that I was working on these issues, I was in Beijing, Jakarta, Delhi, Johannesburg, Lima, talking to people about what they saw within the European Union and how they wanted to interact and engage with the European Union. And those insights, Christoph, those knowledge that I gained, that information, the contacts that I made through the years are now so valuable because, hey, we're talking about the global south. We're talking about a multipolar world. We're talking about engaging on issues. We've had the G20 summit. We've had the BRICS summit. There will be other meetings as well. So all of that knowledge is come back. And also the second thing is diversity and inclusion, anti-racism. I started off my career writing about equality issues. And as we know, they're back on our agenda big time. In fact, geopolitics and race intersect, and we can talk about that a bit later.
Well, I would actually like to pick up right away because you mentioned diversity as one of the main areas of your expertise and experience. And I'm wondering, having been around so many diverse venues globally, how do you assess the way the Brussels bubble is dealing with diversity, and how would you assess the efforts in the Brussels bubble to address diversity and to the need for diversity and to make the debate to include diversity in the political debate?
Hmm. So, they say that the personal is political. And as a European of color, a passionate European, I call myself an accidental European because I landed in Europe as a teenager, having finished my A levels, looking for new opportunities, falling in love with Brussels, really falling in love with the European Union because its talk of its promise of reconciliation and its future forward-looking agenda really spoke to me. I came from South Asia, and as you know, it's a volatile region, lots of conflicts, hot and cold. And that talk of peace and friendship among former enemies really spoke to me. So I am very proud of my Europeanness, despite being a person of color. And I looked around me, and very early on, Christoph, when I started working inside the Brussels bubble first as an intern and then as a reporter, finding my dream job really. As I said, talking about issues of interest to me, I realized that I was one of the few, very few brown people, brown women of Muslim descent. There were none. And in the university I'd been to in Brussels, we were all there. It was so multicultural, so religiously multicultural, races mingled together, we danced together, loved and spoke together all the time. So the bubble was so disconnected from what was happening within Brussels itself, but also in Paris and London and Berlin. People get together, young people work together. And there we were inside the press room, inside these EU institutions. And it was monochromic white. I mean, there is diversity in the EU. Of course there is. I mean, don't question me on that. We're diverse. We're now 27, used to be 28. We may be 35, who knows how much. There is diversity. But it's not an inclusive concept of diversity because total diversity means also including our Europeans of color. We are about 50 million in Europe. And if we don't have a voice, any representation in the EU bubble, in the EU institutions, then we feel disconnected. And you have a society where people are being marginalized. So there was a friend of mine at Politico magazine, Ryan Heath, and he wrote an article that was, I think, a seminal article on Brussels So White, hashtag Brussels So White. And we started having this conversation. And it impacts on our image, but inside, really, Christoph, it impacts on our talent pool. It impacts on our knowledge of the world. It impacts on our skills, and how we interact within ourselves and with the outside world. So it's not just a moral issue, it is a moral issue, but it's also a question of our economic and our political success. So it's become very, very important for me that we push this agenda forward. Now, I've been very long, but just very quickly to say to you, you said, how are we doing? We're not doing that well, but we're making progress. We're inching forward slowly. The problem is we have all our principles, our values. EU values speak to me, the EU values of tolerance and anti-discrimination, diversity, really speak to me. And we have those values. It's actually to implement them. But as you know, we live in a world where there is the far right that is resurgent, across the European Union. We have mainstream politicians in Europe adopting the far right rhetoric. We have racism. We have an anti-racism action plan. But, it's very slow. And my message is, if we don't speed this up, we really risk, if we don't speed this up, we really risk losing the fight against racism and for a more powerful and more potent and credible European Union.
You first used the word was, and then you mentioned the hashtag that I think most people know, Brussels So White, and then you said that something has changed, not much, but something has changed. To be honest, I'm curious to hear your perspective. What has actually changed to the better? What has moved forward? Because I don't see that much change. Brussels is as white. I'm talking about the EU bubble, of course. The EU bubble is as white as it was. And if you feel that something has moved forward, tell me what it is, because I don't see much progress here in my 8 years in the EU bubble so far.
Good question. Yeah, Christoph, it's a very good question. What has changed is, I think, an awareness within the EU institutions, an awareness in the think tank world, in consultancies. It's a very slow process. It's a very frustratingly slow process of acknowledgement of a reality that, as you say, stares you in the face. But you'd be surprised at how many people still have doubts about it, how many pushbacks there are, what a lot of hate mail I get when I talk about these issues. The online abuse is really, really terrible. But what I see, and I'm very constructive because I love this Europe for all its flaws. I recognize that, I have an ability to speak openly here. We live in a democracy. We live in democracies. We have freedom of expression, and I intend to use it. I intend to use it in a constructive manner. And I see among the EU policymakers a new awareness for the last 3 years since the tragic death of George Floyd, when von der Leyen, Ursula von der Leyen, the European Commission president, came out with this very, very ambitious anti-racism action plan and made a very strong promise to the European Parliament to build an anti-racist Europe. And I intend to keep policymakers here and across EU capitals to their word. They have to start implementing what they say. Now, we have the European elections to the Parliament coming up in June 2024. And there, Christoph, I would urge you and all people who believe in this inclusive diversity concept to push for more people to join politics, for political parties to stop hate mongering and talking about the other in such disparaging terms, but to become more inclusive, to put more women, to put more people of color, to put more people with disabilities, to put all kinds of genders on their voting platforms, on their lists. This is not just something that happens with one miracle solution. It's all of us, and especially it needs leadership. And at the moment, Christoph, my heart is breaking a little bit because I don't see that political leadership, that push for really inclusive diversity coming from our European leaders. And that's a real disappointment, I have to say.
Luckily, the professional space around the European institutions, the world of think tanks, associations, consultancies, is becoming more and more diverse, much faster than the institutions. I think you'll agree on that with me. And here I have a question in this debate about how to make the EU bubble more diverse and make it better represent what Europe actually is today. What is the message that you think is missing in this debate, if there is anything like that? What would you want to be more discussed, more debated?
I think we need to talk about these very inconvenient and uncomfortable questions of what is really Europe today. People shy away from discussions on race or our colonial heritage, our colonial legacy, our involvement, our participation in the trade of enslaved people. All of these issues are brushed under the carpet because we want to show ourselves as being really keeping to our values, right? And I think what's missing are these inconvenient and very uncomfortable discussions. As I said to you, I get a lot of pushback when I bring up these issues, and people say, oh, well, you bring up race all the time. I don't bring up race all the time. I bring up the need for diversity all the time, inclusion, talking to all our citizens, and not just talking to the hate that exists in our societies, but not exploiting that hate, but actually countering that hate. Now, there are very few politicians, Christoph, or policymakers, leaders in our communities, our political community, I should say, who are actually doing that. What you get instead are the Geert Wilders, the Thierry Baudets, you get the Eric Zemmours, you get the far right, you get, Viktor Orban, you get in your country, Poland, you get pushbacks. Even our mainstream politicians, you've got Giorgia Meloni, who's in government now, and she's not sending a message of hope or inclusion. It disappoints me. It makes me angry, but more than that, it really disappoints me because this is not the Europe I believe in, and I think Europeans people are showing much more of an openness in their communal spaces, in the municipalities. I think our city mayors, many of them, across the world, really in Europe, even in countries where the governments are far right, are much more open hearted and much more inclusive. Some of our mayors are people of color. So there's hope, really hope. And I always look at the good side, but I have to admit that overall, at the moment, there is a great deal of disenchantment and a disconnect between citizens, what they aspire to, and the leadership we have.
There's one more issue when you discuss building a society of equal rights and equal opportunities for everyone, which is women empowerment. I spoke about it already with my previous guests. That includes Laura Kern from ZN Consulting. Then now she's building up her own consultancy since this summer, and I asked Laura a question that I would like actually to ask you as well. Why do you think, how is it possible that in such a developed part of the world, we still have to discuss? Why is it still something that we have to debate? Something as basic as equal opportunities on the job market for women?
It is sad, isn't it? It's very depressing. This is not happening in Iran or Afghanistan. It's happening here inside this Europe, that we're still discussing equal pay for equal jobs. We're still discussing discrimination at work. We're still discussing harassment at work. And in play, we've just seen we've made progress. Let's be very, very frank. We've made enormous strides in terms of gender equality. We have, right? And this European Commission is very, very determined and is trying its best to do so. Let's see what happens next year. That's going to be the test of whether we actually practice what we preach. But we still have instances like we've just had in Spain, where, in the football world, which I think it represents really society generally, you still have a man representing, I think, the patriarchy, forcing himself on a young woman. And you've seen the outrage this has caused. Now, this is, I think, unacceptable in today's world because, like it or not, we are living in the 21st century. This is 2023, and the world is looking at Europe to see whether we are actually walking our talk. So I think it's really because the patriarchal mindset, the structures, it's systemic. As in the case of racism, actually, there's a parallel there, which we have to see. It's systemic, institutionalized frames, but it's also our mindsets. It starts at home, Christoph. It starts at home, where children watch in curiosity, the word I used in the beginning, how their mother and their father interact. During the pandemic, what were we seeing? We were seeing men grabbing the best table in the house, in the apartment, where the women were working from the kitchen. So those kinds of disparities, a man who looks after his kids is babysitting. Well, no. He's doing his job. He's doing his duty as a father. So many of our concepts are ingrained, and I think it starts at home, but then it goes into the world of work. And it's just one thing I do want to say about this. I'm very much a feminist, as you can imagine. I'm very much determined that women get all the rights, but also then the obligations that come with being in power. And somehow we have a feeling that, and this is sometimes where I disconnect a little bit with the feminist movement, we need women in power who are authentic women, who are not just playing the game according to male rules, because the male rules, the patriarchal rules, are set by the system. So we have to actually, I think, counter that by showing our feminine side. And that is empathy and compassion. That's kindness of the kind that Jacinda Ardern, the former Prime Minister of New Zealand, showed, and Sigrid Kaag in the Netherlands. These are women who are extending a hand to others and are not ashamed of it. Somehow there's a feeling in some feminist circles that you have to be as hard as men to get far. I think that really is not justified, and I think it really lets us down. And finally, I would like more focus and emphasis on intersectionality in feminism as well. The feminists I know, the white feminists I know, don't really care about their sisters who are brown or black. There's very little empathy for them. There's very little connection with their struggles. And that, I think, is a big drawback and a big weakness within our feminist movement in Europe today, in the West more generally. And of course, there are women feminists all over the world. Let's connect with them. And what about our brown and black women here in Europe? Why aren't we connecting with them? So there is a lot of work that needs to be done within our feminist agenda as well. Intersectionality for me is so important, Christoph.
Thank you for sharing your perspective. But I would like to go back to your career, and again, why I admire your career so much, because I'm also a person who likes to wear many hats in their professional life, and this is exactly what you have done in your life. You've been a journalist. You are a journalist, a moderator, an advisor. And there's probably much more that I don't know about. And I wanted to, and this is a specific type of choice that you make. You either stick with one job, or you keep trying different things, and then you build something on top of that. And could you tell me if there was any specific moment, the pivotal moment that influenced how you designed your career, or something that made you who you are today? Was there anything like that in your professional life?
There wasn't a grand design. There really wasn't. I never sat down and planned. I remember when I was much younger, there was this whole thing about how you have to plan your life, and set goals and benchmarks, and then sort of come back and see whether you're meeting those goals. It didn't happen like that. How it did happen was my interests pushed me, and I think communication for me is the key to our lives. How we communicate, how we tell our stories, how we reach out to people, how we engage with people. There was a moment also, I've been passionate about equality for a very long time. And I remember when I was sometimes writing things that I thought were quite harsh and quite critical of certain governments, or certain governments and their policies. I had a moment of doubt about whether I should be doing this. And I remember I had a very wise father, a very, very wise father, and a wise mother, of course. And I remember having these doubts. There'd been a discussion where I'd been sort of taking the side of the underdog, looking at things from a different point of view, is what I call. And he came to me afterwards and he said, Shada, don't ever be afraid of speaking up. And what you did today was great. Speak up when you see injustice. Speak up when you see people not being fair. And that has stayed with me, Christoph. He's passed, of course. That has stayed with me. And every time I get a little hesitant about, oh my God, what's going to be the reaction? I believe that if you really are authentic to yourself and you're not making things up and you're genuine, it's very important to convey that message. And I really, people sometimes ask me why I'm so passionate about this equality business. I've lived among societies which are very unequal. I spent a lot of time in South Asia growing up, till I was 18. I've traveled the world, the global South. I see what inequalities are. Here, where I live now in Brussels, Christoph, there are homeless people around us all the time. We live in unequal societies as well. So that for me is a passion. And I think that sort of colors my view of how we interact with the global South. It's also getting rid of that inequality on the geopolitical landscape, but also how we live in societies. So I would say that was the one thing that stays with me in my career, but also in my personal life. We cannot allow some people to become so marginalized that they drop off the radar. We're all one humanity after all. So let's live those principles, not just talk about them.
Absolutely, absolutely. And how are you? What influence did the technological shift have on your work? I'm asking especially in your advisory work and your journalistic work about the balance between traditional media and social media, also the pace of how media is consumed. How do you feel it changed your work from your perspective?
So to be honest, for me, it's been quite a positive move. A lot of people were very worried when the pandemic set in about how we would be communicating and how we would be doing all the things we've been doing in terms of conferences, research, journalism. Actually, it's added to the value of our work. Of course, there's a terrible toxic side. We know how terrible that is. I've talked about online abuse, and there's all online and offline abuse. But for me, I've always tried, when I was working as a think tanker, when we were talking about, say, Asia or Africa, I just disliked so passionately the fact that we would bring in academics from France, from Britain, from Germany. We would sit around a table, and I was part of those discussions, sit around the table and talk about them, the other, living there, how they should be doing this, giving them instructions, being so prescriptive, and nobody was listening to their voices. So when I joined the think tank world, European Policy Center, and then Friends of Europe, I was even then, 15 years ago, bringing in the voices of the Japanese, the Chinese, the Indians, Africans, bringing them into our conversations. And we were doing it, you had to get visas, you had to pay for the flights, and then there was all this problem of getting visas, Then I would try and bring them in through Skype, and that didn't work very well. But now 3 years ago, it was a no-brainer. We just moved. So we started hearing their voices. And I think this recognition of the multipolar world and global south is very much part of the fact that we now hear those voices loud and clear on our social media pages, online, in our conferences, and slowly also in our mainstream media. But our mainstream media, Christoph, in Europe, and I think you probably agree, is very Eurocentric. It's very, very focused on Europe, with very little regard for what's happening in the other world, unless their citizens are involved, unless they have an interest in that, unless it's geopolitical. Everything is geopolitical. So I think for me, social media is a tool that I employ carefully, cautiously, but I do employ quite often.
And what's your take on networking? How to do it well in the EU bubble? What are the best practices you could teach us today?
So obviously, as Groucho Marx said, 80% of everything is just being there. So I think it's very important when you're starting off in your career, as actually making yourself available for all kinds of opportunities, going to these conferences, going to the parliamentary hearings, going to the press room if you're a journalist. You have to be there. You have to make your voice heard. You have to make your presence felt. It's very important to be there, engage. I think it's very interesting also to have, if you can, I was blessed. I had some very good mentors, two women, an Italian woman, a journalist with whom I worked, and a British woman with whom I worked. And they were great mentors. They gave me insights into how the EU worked and provided me with the kind of, know-how and intelligence that I needed starting off. So mentorship is very important. And I think also, once again, interest and curiosity, I think, are very important. Now, networking requires time. It can be quite boring, but it can be quite useful. So be there, get engaged, join clubs that do things that interest you. Social media, go on networks that, include you. I think social media plays a very big part. For me, it's sometimes really a shelter where I go to and find people who think like me. And then we can do things together. So networking is important. But I think in that networking, one shouldn't forget one's authenticity as well. We shouldn't try and play everyone's game and try and fit in. Often I'm asked, being different can be a disadvantage in this bubble because everyone, looks alike, often thinks alike. There is a certain tedium to that, it's monochromic, but also mono thinking sometimes, right? And I think you have to be a bit different to stand out. You shouldn't be afraid of being different. I tell a lot of my friends who are from, communities of color, and they say, why should we join the EU, bubble? They feel not represented. They'd rather not be part of that. They'd rather be setting up their own company. Why join a think tank when you can be making money working for a bank? Because businesses, as you said, are very open. But if you want to be part of the policy-making machine, if you want to have a say in this wonderful Europe, then you should be part of this. So join political parties, join community services, make your voice heard, and don't be afraid of being different. Being different is an asset, and be proud of your difference.
One thing I wanted to ask, because you have this experience of both working as a journalist and also an advisor consultant, from your perspective, what do people don't know about the work of journalists that is important, that could help people build better relationship with journalists, and especially communicators, consultants, be more valuable to journalists as a contact?
I think most people don't realize, unless they live with you, that how hard journalists work, how hard we work, how hard these consultancies, advisors, strategists, etc., how hard we work. People have a feeling that moderating a conference, an event, it's just it's a game. You can just drop in and start moderating, ask a few questions, etc., and all the preparation that goes into it. Or that when you're writing an article and you're a good journalist writing an article, how many people you're talking to, how many ideas you're exploring, the brainstorms you have to do, how much time you spend, how much effort you put in. I think there's a feeling here among some of the policymakers that everything is, they're working hard, they're making policy, but all of us around them are just basically, dilettantes, doing we have hobbies. Journalism is a hobby. Journalism is not a hobby. Strategy advice is not a hobby. It's serious work. And I think, but I'll say one thing: once you build the trust, what's very important in our daily lives, in our profession, and also in our private lives, is when you build the trust, when you work together for a bit and you get to know each other better. That trust means that you understand the difficulties, the challenges both sides face. So I think that's a very important thing. And sometimes also people think, oh, well, communication, anyone can do it. Anyone can communicate. You just have to give a few facts and figures. You just have to say how alarming the rates are of, inequality. And then people understand that's all you have to do. I wish it were that simple. It's not. Communication is a skill. It's an art. It's something you have to learn. Anyone can learn it. So I think there's a lot of, I would say, misunderstanding about how hard other people work. We always think we work very hard. We're burning the midnight oil, but we forget that everyone here in the Brussels bubble really is actually working very, very hard.
Shada, now I have a question that I actually ask most of the guests of my podcast, especially those who deal with communications and media. And that is the sort of holy grail of the EU bubble: how to speak about complex issues in words that people who are not experts in the field understand. What's your take on that? How do you make sure that when you write about complex EU issues, or when you speak to lawmakers about some industry challenges, how do you make sure that you will be understood?
So I'm not actually speaking to lawmakers about industry challenges. I'm speaking to them about things like racism, where I have a lot of passion and I can bring that in. So, but I'll say it's what some people call the curse of knowledge. So we in the bubble are blessed with a lot of knowledge, but also it's a curse because you get lost in the facts and figures, as I was saying. You get lost in the trees, the fauna and the flora, and you forget to see the bigger picture. And the way I train, because I'm doing a bit of media training for organizations, is that knowledge is what gives you your comfort zone. That's where you get all your strength, your intellectual strength from. But your real task is to sort of refine that knowledge into a narrative, a story. And people from when time began, when our ancestors were sitting around the fire in caves, that's where the story started. And if you build a compelling, interesting, stimulating, thought-provoking story, that is what gets people's attention. It's not just the facts and figures. Of course, it has to be evidence-based, but that's a no-brainer. but then move into the empathy, move into the emotion, move into your inner being, and that I think is when it makes a difference. People worry, oh, you're simplifying, oh, you're dumbing down, oh, how can you talk in these sort of terms? But you're not dumbing down. You're simplifying because you understand it, and your mission as a communicator is to make other people understand. It's not to show how clever you are. We're all very clever here in the Brussels Public System. We're all super intelligent. We've all, done brilliantly at university, written great academic papers, done our PhDs, and then you come here and you say, oh, well, I'm not going to speak in that kind of language. Well, unfortunately, if you want to convince your voters, the parliamentarians or EU policymakers or journalists, you have to speak a different language. And the final thing I say is, and that doesn't mean that you stray away from complexity. We live in a very complex world. I dislike this binary stuff that we're getting into now. It's very sort of, you're either good or you're bad or you're pretty or you're ugly. The world isn't like that. And I think that you can convey with simplicity as well. But final thing, once again, I'd say is you have to believe in it yourself. And I'm lucky that I'm working on topics where I really have a deep personal conviction are the right way to go. That's my conviction.
And the final question I have is, you sort of already built an interesting ground for that, because you said how passionate you are about your work many times, and also you mentioned how people don't understand how hard the work of journalists is. And I take from that this also means that you put a lot of effort into the work you do. How do you make sure that you meet all your professional demands, but also live a happy life outside of work? How do you make sure that there is a balance between both?
So I have to say there have been different periods in my life when the kids were younger. I have two kids, a boy and a girl. When they were younger, it was a struggle, but I was also very lucky. Childcare in Belgium is very, very good. I had an ex-husband who did his share of work as well. So as a upcoming, rather ambitious reporter, doing the late night marathons and going covering things in faraway places because I was traveling a lot, I did have help. And I think that's very, very crucial. You need that. In those days also, we were very few women in the press room, in the bubble, very few women with children. In those days, women were making a choice, deliberately or not deliberately, of either going for the profession of journalism or having children. We were about maybe a handful of young mothers, and we were constantly talking to each other, exchanging tips, helping each other out as well. And I think that community of solidarity that we created has stuck with us now. Our kids are all grown up now, but we're still very good friends because we lived through that period of challenging period, really. And now, of course, Christoph, I'm in a luckier place. I've the kids are all grown up, working, etc. I have more time, and I have to say that especially since I started my own company, where I'm being selective in who I work with, in who I engage with, it has to speak to me before I take on the task. That I have more time, and there is more time to be myself. And work-life balance now is a real issue. When I was working hard, there was no such thing as working from home. If your kid was not well, you had to find a babysitter or you had to take a day off. There's very little understanding for the fact that a mother or a father had to work from home. And now it's so much easier. I mean, when I was managing teams at Friends of Europe, it was when somebody had to do something for their children or had a dentist appointment for themselves. Of course, you did it, at least I made sure they did it. So that's become easier. And then one thing that keeps me going is yoga and meditation. I take retreats 3 times a year for sure. If I'm lucky, 4 times a year. Sometimes only a week, sometimes 2 weeks. Take time off, go with my partner, and just chill, literally, and compartmentalize. So shut off those professional emails, at least, put them on hold And I think if you don't do that, you get gobbled up by the system, and there's a real danger of burnout. And I think it's very important that we also, as human beings, flourish, not just as professionals. And a good human being is also a good professional. So it's very important to have that right work-life balance. And I'm so happy that now it's really high up on our agenda, on our equality agenda.
I couldn't agree more. That's why I asked this question, because I want, if there is any know-how out there, how to make it work, I want it to be available. I want it to be heard. And thank you very much for sharing your thoughts. I'm definitely looking forward to yoga retreats once my kids are out of the house.
That's what you need.
Shada,
Yeah.
thank you
But
very
go with
much for
them for
today. Yeah.
walks.
Yes.
I was saying no, but with the kids, of course, you're in the forest every day or as often as you can. They're biking, you're running, you're walking. Nature is great. I mean, I live near the Bois de la Cambre, not to reveal any
Lovely area.
confidential information though.
Lovely area.
But yeah, yeah.
And my
So,
kids love it as well.
you get a exactly.
Shada, thank you very much for your time today and for sharing so many interesting insights and your perspective on all the topics that we discussed. To everyone who listened to us, thank you very much for being with us. Shada Islam, the Managing Director of New Horizons Project, was our guest today. Thank you. Have a great day.
Thank you very much, Christoph, for having me.